Good morning, everybody. I'll sit down because otherwise I'll be pacing and that gets very old. And so as Brian said, my name is Eric. Judy and I have been members here in the church since about, since about 2004. And for about 4 years in the middle there, I think it's good with the echo, it makes my voice more authoritative. I like it. We were living in the Middle East and in Jerusalem, and people in this church actually, some people in this church kind of, prayed for us, wrote to us, stayed connected, and I think some very good friendships have grown out of that, and also a sense of support, and you're going to see very quickly how this influences today's talk. I want to take a step back and speak a little bit about the broader series we've been in about reconciliation in a time of fear. And we've been talking about social justice. And depending where you come from, social justice is a term that can be loaded. I think the next slide is blank, and that's fine. So it's a term that can be loaded, that can evoke different things to different people, and that is fine. And I think the way we're trying to move together as a church is to have this dialogue. So people have been sending feedback from the discussion in the discussion groups, discipleship groups. If you're not in a discipleship group, you can write. There's an email you can find in the bulletin and kind of give your comments. And today is going to be no exception. But I want to start by saying that talking about social justice kind of pulls at the heart of a little bit, what are we as a community and why are we here? And I think sometimes we come to church to kind of be in that community, be encouraged towards, what does it mean to follow Jesus? What does it mean to connect to God? I mean, it's not always the most natural thing to feel connected to God. I mean, maybe for all you guys, but for some other people like me, it's a bit of a struggle. And we come to be encouraged, we come to be nurtured. Also, life is not always, all, rainbows and unicorns. And sometimes it's a struggle, and we come to church to be comforted, to be encouraged, to be put at peace, and deal with different kind of feelings. And so that's, when we talk about social justice, all of a sudden we're talking about things that are big, because we're not just talking often about one person. We're talking about often groups of persons. And I think even in our past, Sundays, I think that there could have been topics and issues that kind of resonated differently with each one of us. For example, Ruth, talked, I think, 2 weeks ago. She talked about generosity and greed, and that links to kind of how money matters in society. And one of the things she showed on the slide was to say, well, 20% of us, we're part of the 20% of the richest people in the world, which is probably a statistical truth. But not everybody in this church, drove a Bentley to the parking lot. And you may be, some people lose jobs, some people have financial struggles and burdens. So you may be in a position of being extremely, under stress and maybe overwhelmed by what you don't have. And all of a sudden you come to church and it says, well, you're part of the rich ones. So what do? So you see that, and I kind of like the message that was spoken, and I think we need to grow in that. But at an individual level, this could be disconcerting. And we talked about race, right? When we see the news, we know what's happening, we've had a panel discussion, we've had Rory and Matthew have a dialogue, and we know that there are things happening right now in our society, and that these things matter. There's the movement Black Lives Matter, and how can you not think about these things in today's world? And in our country, I recently got my American passport, so now I can say in our country. I'm part of you guys, whether you like it or not. And but how can you close your eyes to that? No matter what you think, but at the same time, at an individual level, I think there's a friend, we had a little bit of an exchange on Facebook, the Cedar book this week, and it was like, well, but I've been a victim of discrimination. I've been a victim of, injustice and everything. And as an individual, not as a group. So how can you, I mean, the friend wasn't saying that, I'm extrapolating, but saying, you know, you could be feeling like, how can I now associate with a group that is discriminated against, that suffers from injustice, when I feel like I'm not in the oppressive group, I'm not, so you see how social justice pulls at you like, at an individual level, I'm in this reality, and then at a collective level, you're asking me to look at it differently. And I think there's a tension there. And it's a really, really important tension, and we see it in the life of the church. And I want to confront two ways of not coming to church, but hearing about our journey together. And I want to read a verse that comes from the gospel when Jesus talks to the disciples. And he says, I am leaving you with a gift, peace of mind and heart. And the peace I give is a gift the world cannot give. So don't be troubled and afraid. If you take a minute to digest these words, these are some of the kind of things that I personally need to hear and feel and be nurtured into when I come to church. Peace, quiet. I need that in the church. And then now let's look at, we're going to look at another slide, which is a Franciscan benediction. It's a prayer. And it says, may God bless you with anger at injustice, oppression and exploitation of people, so that you may work for justice, freedom, and peace. May God bless you with tears to shed for those who suffer pain, rejection, hunger, and war, so that you may reach out your hand to comfort them and to turn their pain into joy. And may God bless you with enough foolishness to believe that you can make a difference in the world, so that you can do what others claim cannot be done, to bring justice and kindness to all our children and the poor. And to me, that's a very powerful prayer as well. But depending on my state of mind, when I'm going to come to church, I'm going to be ready to hear that prayer, or I'm going to be, oh no. And I think it's okay to realize that. And we're called to move together as a church. We're talking about, you know, becoming a movement of peace. We dare to dream on heaven on earth. You know, we don't usually have our vision statement. So that means we need to grow in these things and take the courage to do that. So I want you to, you know, take a second and think about that and the emotions you've had as we've walked through these discussions about, you know, social justice and reconciliation in time of fear. And if you have a paper and a pencil, you know, while I talk, it's fine to write some things and bring them to your discipleship group, or bring them in an email and say, how do I feel about this tension? Do I feel afraid? Do I feel encouraged? Do I feel hopeful? Do I feel fearful? And let's bring that together, because it's not all of us following one person, it's all of us growing together as a community. So today I'm going to speak about healing religion, and there's many things I could say about how we want our religions to be more inclusive and different things. And actually our own Brian McLaren has another book out. This guy writes books faster than I can read them, but he's got a great book that's called Why Did Jesus, Moses, Muhammad, and the Buddha Cross the Road? It's a very good book. I recommend, you know, reading it, and it's about how to be stronger in our convictions as Christians, and at the same time more accepting of others, and including very interesting discussions of other religions. And I could try to summarize the book, but I think we'll have to wait till Brian comes back one of these days or something like this. That's not what I'm going to do. You know, as I said, I've got an American passport, but I still have a French passport, so I like to get into trouble. And so if I'm going to speak about healing religion, I'm going to bring it down to something that's very hard, that's going to bring tensions. And I do not expect that all of you will agree with anything I say, and that's okay. And you will have to bring that to your discipleship group, you'll have to write it down. This is not a good design for dialogue, but we want to keep it at core, at the community level, a dialogue. So I'm going to talk about how our main religions of the world, at least until the monotheist religions, we're not talking about Buddhism and Hinduism, though there'll be many things to say about that, but we're going to look at one place in time and history, our time and our history right now, and how it plays out in the hotbed and hot potato of the world, which is the Israel-Palestinian conflict, and how the church stands on it. And just saying that, I'm sure some of you maybe have red flag perking up. And I think that's okay to note that in your piece of paper, in your mind, and say, I have a red flag, you know, and bring that to the discipleship group. I do not expect that everything I'm going to say is going to be, amen, this guy's got it right. But I want to challenge you and challenge us to try to see if we can move forward. So since I'm going to talk about this difficult topic, we're going to start with a 6-minute video clip. So it's a little long, I'm sorry, but 6 minutes is a pretty good time frame if you think of the history we're going to summarize. And it's produced by a group called Jewish Voice for Peace. And I find it a pretty honest narrative of the situation, a real life now situation in this world. So it's actually 6 minutes and 27 seconds. And I invite you to just watch it, and we're going to be talking about some of that afterwards.
What would happen if you built a refuge for a persecuted people in a place where another people already lived? In the next few minutes, you'll learn why this moral quandary is at the root of the struggle between Israelis and Palestinians, and what you can do to help achieve a just peace for everyone in the region. First, there are a couple of things it's helpful to understand. One, many Jews fled harsh persecution in anti-Semitic Europe, especially the Nazi Holocaust. Zionists encouraged massive emigration to historic Palestine, at that time a British colony, where Jews had an age-old connection and where small Jewish communities had long existed among larger groups of indigenous peoples. But when the UN offered the Jewish immigrants the majority of the land for a new state called Israel, for the indigenous Palestinians who lived there, it was a massive destruction of life. They rejected the UN's partition plan, and several Arab states invaded the new state of Israel. Israeli forces essentially erased over 400 Palestinian villages and towns. By the end of the fighting, Israel controlled 78% of historic Palestine. And when 750,000 Palestinians who fled or were expelled during fighting tried to return to their homes where the new state now stood, they were permanently barred by the Israeli government. While over 100,000 of their relatives and neighbors who hadn't left became second-class citizens of the new state, along with the new Jewish majority. Today, Palestinian refugees and their descendants number in the millions. Most are in the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and Jordan. Many are spread throughout the world, with millions still living in refugee camps, seeking to return to their homeland. To sum up, one group of refugees found a much-needed home, but in the process, a new group of refugees was created. Here's the second thing to understand. Israel was founded as a Jewish state, but now ask yourself, what exactly does that mean? People had lots of ideas about what a Jewish state should look like. Some called for equality for all citizens. But what was created, in practice, was institutional discrimination against non-Jews. In other words, Israel ended up being built on a blueprint of exclusion. The Israeli government wants maximum land and resources for Jews, but not the Palestinians living there. That's why, inside Israel, Jews get special privileges, including rights to land and housing, that are denied to the Palestinian citizens, who make up 20% of Israel's population. That's also part of why Israel has never defined its borders. In fact, they still hold on to land, the West Bank and Gaza, that they conquered in the war in 1967. Since then, Israel has built Jewish settlements throughout the occupied West Bank, building Jewish-only cities and supplying them with infrastructure like roads and army camps, schools, and even a college. Military occupations are meant to be temporary, but after 40-plus years, this one looks permanent and entirely unjust. In the West Bank, Israeli Jewish settlers and Palestinians live on the same land, but must live under two completely separate and unequal systems of Israeli law. The Jewish settlers dominate the natural resources, including water and agricultural land, and they're backed by the Israeli army. To maintain the occupation, Israel has demolished thousands of Palestinian homes and orchards, confiscated Palestinian land, bombed a captive civilian population in Gaza, and punished resistance with raids, arrests, and assassinations. all to gain maximum land while making life so difficult for Palestinians that they will either leave or be too afraid to resist. Palestinians have fought back. For decades, they tried to achieve national liberation through armed struggle. Some groups still do. But the majority now support popular protest instead. The deeply harmful pattern of control, repression, and violence profoundly harms Palestinians living under occupation and Israelis living as occupiers. This must be broken to reach a peaceful and secure future for both peoples. Now that you understand the problem, what about the solution? What about peace talks? So far, over 2 decades of U.S.-backed peace talks have actually made things worse by helping Israel continue the occupation. It's been years of talking while Israel massively expanded the Jewish settlements and literally redrew the map. Peace talks are good if they're real, but not when they're theater to cover a land grab. So now what? The current world superpower, the United States, has been a terrible friend, enabling Israel's destructive and self-destructive expansion onto Palestinian land by funding the Israeli military, the biggest recipient of U.S. foreign aid in the world. But there's another superpower that can make the difference: you. There's a movement with hundreds of thousands of people just like you across the world, including Palestinians and Israelis, protesting, educating, divesting, and boycotting, all to bring nonviolent international pressure on Israel to stop violating human rights of Palestinians. Throughout history, where governments have failed to push for justice, people just like you, like us, have taken the lead and won. Now it's the Palestinians' turn for freedom and justice. We can pressure Israel to end the occupation and the discrimination. We want all people, Jews and Palestinians, to have equality, human rights, and democracy. We can change history. Join us.
So thank you for indulging in a little bit of modern history illustration. And again, I realize that this narrative may seem at odds with some of the notions you've had, and that's fine, and that these things can be questioned. What I want to talk about now is the top reasons why the church, we shouldn't get involved. So I'm going to read through 6 main reasons why we shouldn't get involved at all. And we're going to see how it goes. And again, I want you to be honest with your feelings and your, internal critic of what we're discussing. And we need to continue this discussion as a community. So the first reason is, well, it's been like this for thousands of years, so, we're not going to change anything. It's been like this for thousands of years. These things are way out. Then the second thing is, what about the whole thing about the Bible, Israel, the end time, Jesus coming back, the apocalypse? So, you don't want to be on the wrong side of Jesus when he comes back, kind of a thing. The third reason we shouldn't get involved is it's messy, it's confusing, and plus the church has a history of anti-Semitism. So, again, do we want to tread, on something that may, lead us in something like this? The fourth reason we shouldn't get involved is it has nothing to do with us. And then the fifth thing is it's political, and it's not the kind of thing that the church should get involved with. And I think it's going to be an important point to discuss, not just today, me talking to you, but as a community. And that goes beyond the healing religion and Israel-Palestine. It goes to all the topics we're bringing to this table. And these things we'll be revisiting together when we have this forum on June 6th. Where do we stand on the history of, racial reconciliation, healing, and progress? Where do we stand on all these things? So this argument is not going to be ended today. I just offered to stop talking about it. And then the last one is, well, we don't want to support the terrorists. So I'll have something to say about who we may want to support. So let's look at the first slide. It's been like this for 1,000 years. Well, it's almost the easiest to discuss, because if you're coming to me and saying it's been like this for 1,000 years, you're not going to have much history to give me about it. This is a slogan. We just saw a little clip about the history. This is not a 1,000-year history. It's a 7-year history. If you look at the historical origins in anti-Semitism in Europe and the persecution of the Jews in Europe, that's 150 years history. And it's happening right now. We've seen some examples in the clips, and we'll see a couple more. It's happening now. We're not talking about 1,000 years history. This is just essentially propaganda, and that's not what we should be following. Let's look at some. It's hard enough, so let's look at some of the fact. So let's talk about the next one. It's been like this, you know, not it's been like this, but what about this thing about the Bible? So depending where you grew up religiously, and I realize there's diversity among us, but some groups among us have grown in kind of fairly traditional, evangelical, or different kind of churches, with a strong, and that's a good thing, strong attachment to the Bible, but also with a certain way to look at the Bible. And there's a certain number of steps, like this happens, and this happens, and this happens, and you know, there's a war, there's an Armageddon, then Jesus returns. And no matter how we've evolved in how we look at these things often have been part of the background of how we've looked at our religion, and we may not have thought about these things much, or we may still, you know, believe in a very ordered, that's the end time scenario. We have a roadmap, this is how it's going to happen. But even if we don't kind of literally really believe, you know, in this, emotionally there's kind of a narrative, a very strong narrative that's been created about how things are going to happen. And one thing I've observed is that then the behavior tends to be, it's all written, so we don't need to do anything about it. We know it's going to be terrible, there's going to be people killing each other and everything, so hey, you know, it's too bad. Or in some way we're kind of compelled to help this scenario play out. So there's going to be Armageddon or something, and somehow we're supposed to be, you know, on a confusing side, whereas this conflict, apocalyptic conflict, is supposed to happen. And I like to bring it down, you know, a notch and be very concrete about things. And if I tell you a story about some injustice happening to somebody I know by somebody else, and actually I've done this with friends, you know, with whom we had disagreement, and said, this is what happened to that person. Do you think it was right? Do you think the other person was right or was wrong? Come to, you know, somebody stole somebody's house, kick them out, you know, something like this. It's pretty clear what is right and what is wrong. So should that judgment of what is right and wrong be changed if I tell you, wait. Now I'm going to tell you that this person who did that was of that religion, and that person was of that other religion. This person was an Arab, this person was a Jew, or this person was a Muslim, so they're Jew. Same thing, this person was, you know, of a darker skin color, this person was white. It's the same issue. Is our sense of justice, of what is right and wrong, does it vary by the skin color? Does it vary by the ethnic origin of people? Does it vary by their religion? And this becomes a very nitty-gritty, right-now question. And we may believe many things about the apocalypse and, you know, trumpets blowing and Jesus coming on a horse and all these things. And, you know, if it happens, fine. I say, hey, you know, maybe I'm a little surprised, but let's roll, you know. But in the meantime, can anything that I believe about some apocalyptic end time justify that I would come to Vic and treat you unjustly, or treat you with contempt, or treat you with some sort of, no, we can't have a gospel that is, so that the next slide I had is our gospel, is the good news. You're supposed to see arrows. Is the good news, is justice, is compassion, is right or wrong, is shalom itself. Is that based on ethnicity, race, or religion of the people? Or if we have, as followers of Jesus, a healing religion, you know, do we believe that God prefers certain people because of physical, genetic, or historical characteristics? If you ask a question like this, it's very rare that we're going to say, of course, the gospel prefers these people. And actually, we're still dealing with the remnants of that in the past, in our collective histories. So I think this whole thing about the end times, if you bring it down to humans, now, today, our neighbors, whom we're called to love, then it kind of fades away. So the next question we have, the next reason not to get involved, is it's messy and confusing, and the church has a history of anti-Semitism. And I think those are almost two things. It's confusing and messy. I think all conflicts end up being messy and confusing. I think the narrative can be clarified a little bit, yet at the same time, people are going to hold on to their part of the narrative. And the history of anti-Semitism in the broader church, again, it's like I was talking at the beginning, this social justice. I may never have any inclination to anti-Semitism. It may not have been part of my background, or I may have been born with a Jewish background, and I don't relate to that. But historically, as churches, there has been anti-Semitism, and there is still in the world anti-Semitism. We could be having a Sunday, about anti-Semitism. That would be a legitimate topic for social justice. It still exists. So how do we deal with that? And how do we deal with that with the fear of that past, the guilt of that past? And then saying, well, we're going to take one side on this conflict because of this fear or this guilt. And there's this gentleman called Mark Breverman. He's actually a resident of Montgomery County. He's a Jewish guy who has led a number of things and written very interesting books. And he talks to churches. And one of the things he started saying to churches, he started saying, guys, thank you for your sympathy for Israel, but you have to do something else with your Christian guilt. And if we are going to be a healing religion, swimming in guilt and in fear of guilt is not going to be healing. And there are people taking a stand. There are Jewish people, there are Christian people, there are Muslim people taking a stance. Do we want to be standing with them, or do we want to say, no, that it's just too messy, we don't want to be involved? And so that's something to think about. Yes, there's a church history of anti-Semitism. What does it mean? Does it mean we align with one side of a faction, or does it mean that we align for peace and continue regarding each individual and neighbor as a neighbor that God calls us to love? Let's talk about the messiness, if we can have the next slide. This is bar graphs. It's the less human thing that you can see is a bar graph. And the red bars are the number of Palestinians killed per year, and the blue bars the number of Israelis. And as a church, as Christians, as citizens of this planet, I think each life matters the same. Each life matters the same. And what we have to realize is that on this side of the world, when blue bars happen, and blue bars are individuals, men, women, children who die on the Israeli side, we hear about it, and our frontline news tell us about it. When the red bars happen, we don't hear about it. And I've lived there, I've got phone numbers on my line, I can tell you when people are under threats, I can tell you when my friends go and pick up body parts, because helicopters have blown people up. And you may think about the politics and the many things of it, but that is part of the reality. That is maybe messy, but at least that is a fact. Let's look at the next slide. That's the distribution of the land. We saw a little bit of it on the clip. And we could be discussing about these maps, but the green areas are kind of Palestinian lands, which of course before 1948, it was Ottoman occupation, so it's not that simple. But if you look at going all the way to the right side, that last picture is 2000. If I showed you a picture for 2015, it would be even more confettis. And we're talking about the space between, Laurel and Bowie or something. We're talking about tiny space, and they're getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So even though it's messy and confusing, there's a reality on the ground that is happening. There's a people group that's getting confined to these green areas, and they are getting smaller. That part is factual and undebatable. Let's look at the next slide. And this happens with, on the top right corner, this is a kind of wall that ends up surrounding a neighborhood. I actually believe this one is in Bethlehem. So Bethlehem, every time we talk about Bethlehem here, I always wince a little bit, because I think about families that live behind this war, with a Mirador overseeing them. There's home demolitions. So your home gets demolished because you're Palestinian, you're illegal, but nothing that you do, your existence is not legal. And then you end up creating enclaves. It's maybe hard to see on this map, but basically you live in an enclave surrounded by a wall. These things are very physical reality, undeniable. I took Israeli friends to see that. I got them through, and we went, and one of these guys started crying, and he said, I didn't know we were doing that. So of course we here don't know it either that much. I want to show another slide. And these are pictures from last summer. And it's Gaza, which, as far as we're concerned here, it's like on the moon. It's on Mars. It's not people we know. Well, the difference is that I have a lot of phone numbers here that are in Gaza. I met real people that, you know, a gentleman in Al-Quds University who's studying Jewish history. And those are real people. And we hear about the violence from Gaza to Israel. And some of this violence is blind. You know, it's sending rockets to target, you know, civilian populations. That's true, that happens. And the common term for that is terrorism, because it's undiscriminate violence towards civilians to achieve a political gain. So that happens. I'm not denying this. I'm saying the victims of that were also civilians. And how long do we want that to keep up? Half of the population living in these rubbles is less than 18 years old. They have grown and lived in a space between, I said, Laurel and Bowie. I mean, we'd have to check, but that's a scale. With a roll around there, Miradors, helicopters, F-16s flying over their head, they've never stepped outside. This is today's reality. This is very real. Maybe it's all their fault, but this is today's reality, and how do you grow as a society in this context? And so I just wanted to bring that to light. And then the next slide is another reason not to get involved. Well, it has nothing to do with us. Eric, we're very sorry. It's a terrible thing what's happening to these people. But honestly, it really doesn't have anything to do with us. So that's a valid argument. If we can have the next slide. The US Senate unanimously passes resolutions supporting Israeli assault on Gaza. When's the last time that the Senate was unanimous about anything? Anything at all. And yet, you know, we said it's messy and confusing, and this one is so clear that we have 100% vote for this mass-scale bombing. That's kind of triggering. US military aid to Israel is, you know, on a huge scale. Say, well, that's because they're allies, fine, and they need to defend themselves. Well, we're not in 1967 anymore, where, you know, Israel was considered the weak element. You know, why are we giving all these weapons? Most of the bombs dropped on Gaza were paid out of our taxes. We paid for this. So, you know, if we consider that some countries are responsible for harboring violence in the form of terrorism, we at least have a responsibility. We can debate whether it's guilt or not, but we at least have responsibility for having our political leaders voting for and our taxes paying for this war. And then the blue one doesn't show, sorry, poor choice of colors, but it says that the Palestinians are, you know, applying to get statehood recognition as a state, which is official US government policy. And as a response, they are facing sanctions from the US government. So we're saying the solution is two states. Why doesn't everybody just get along? Everybody gets behind their borders. We've seen that the borders are disappearing. But then when one side says, oh, okay, we want a state, we say, no, you're being punished. Now is not the time, and it has not been the time for a very long time. So the point of this is to say, we here, maybe we don't have so much to do with it, but as a nation, we have to recognize that we are kind of taken a stance on this. And so I want to go to the next question. And the next question, the next reason not to get involved is it's political. And it's not the kind of thing that the church should get involved with. And I think that question is very important for this community in this series on social justice. And again, it is for our community. So I'm grateful for the privilege to speak to you today. But the important message is the one that we're writing together, and that we're going to continue writing together in the discipleship group, in the forum. If you're not in a discipleship group, find a way to connect, email. But let's look at some of the things. So I went back to the kind of Amos series, and if you remember the Amos series, on the left side I've got my little blocks, there's little me. So it looks blue, I'm blue, so this is little me. Then there's little us, Cedar Ridge Community Church, way on top on the left. Then there's our capital, kind of the state, the government, and then there's the whole world. And then, if you remember one of the messages that Ruth gave us, it was about, well, even, manufacturing shoes, we know that somehow it kind of sometimes contribute to child labor. And it's kind of like we're always 20 steps removed from something wrong in the world. So, and child labor is a terrible thing. But at the same time, as an individual sitting here, I'm kind of not exactly sure how these shoes were made. I mean, I bought the shoes, I need shoes, and I could have come barefoot, but, it wouldn't have looked good. So, I'm not saying, I'm not dissing Ruth, we've talked a lot with Ruth, but sometimes it's hard to know how do I relate, because we're almost 6 steps from everything. As I said, I've got a friend on Facebook who absolutely wants me to boycott Nutella now. I'm like, okay, but it's not always easy to know where to draw the line and what we can do and what we cannot do. So let's look at some of the things that we do, that we can do. Next slide. And these are some pictures of, from our website about some of what we do at Cedar Ridge. And you have the community garden. This is a hands-on, literally nurturing the earth. And with this nurturing the earth, nurturing the community. And I said that as somebody, I don't really have the physical stamina to do a lot of gardening. I'm no good at it, so I haven't been the most active in our community garden, and that's an understatement. But that's something we do together that nurtures the earth, nurtures our community, and then nurtures our neighbors. That is something good to kind of bring some healing to this world. You can look at the work we do in Ipala, and we do it as a dialogue, as a relationship. We can look at some of the generosity was manifested, because we're able to, some of what we do to really build a sense of community here. And I think those are important things. And our debate about social justice should not be either or. It should be about how we keep building, how we keep taking courageous, challenging steps. But the next slide is looking at examples that have gone beyond that. So you might not recognize all the faces. You get 10 points if you recognize the French dude. But basically you've got others. You've got John Newton, who wrote, Amazing Grace after having been a slave trader. You've got Richard Wilberforce in the UK. You've got Mother Teresa. You've got Rosa Parks. You've got Desmond Tutu. Of course, you've got MLK. And the bearded white dude is Laletière, who's a priest that stood for the homeless. And my point is that these people were in a church community. And as an individual, they felt triggered by injustice. And they took a stand, and somehow that rippled into their church community. And somehow that rippled into their country and the world. And I think there's something to be thought about that. And if you want to travel in time and go 50 years ahead, when we look back at our church and our community and some of the challenges that we're facing in this world today. And I think this comment is not specific to today's topic, where, I've kind of brought religion through the focus of the Israel-Palestine challenge. But it looks at, race in America, it looks at poverty, it looks at war, it looks at violence. On any of these things, where do we want to think that our church will have gone, if we were able to travel in time and look back? So the next slide has some examples that we can look back. Slavery in the US. There were a lot of churches that were like, hey, man, that's pretty far removed. What are we going to do? Or we don't care, or we even support it. And then you had the Quakers. So at a time and place, you had the Quakers that stood and said slavery is wrong. And not only do we need to say it's wrong, we need to take action and change it. So it is possible to be that voice. Look at slave trade in the UK. I mentioned Richard Wilberforce. If you've seen the movie or read the book, I can't remember the name, it'll come back to somebody. But about Richard Wilberforce, he was in the UK. What is interesting in the example of Richard Wilberforce is that he was kind of part of the Methodist Church. But in the UK at that time, unlike the US, I shouldn't say that Matthew's going to be bragging about it, but there was actually no slavery in the UK at that time. So, there was no slave in the UK, people were free. But Wilberforce looked at slave trade, and the UK was very involved with a huge, merchant fleet in slave trade. And Wilberforce said, that slave trade that happens oceans away, it is us being part of an evil, and we need to stand against it. And he stood and he brought the Methodist Church, and they grew as a community, not just as activists, throwing rocks, which I don't think is the vision we have for ourselves. They grew as a community, encouraging each other to grow in Christ, but also be accountable and responsible for their here and now, as we need to be. We look at Europe, 1933. A gentleman that wrote this book called Mein Kampf, means My Struggle, where he describes a political agenda of destruction, racism, anti-Semitism, death, and war. Very many churches were silent, too political. It's not the kind of things the church should deal with. And then there are a few people that said, no. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, as a pastor, I have to stand against that. Now, when we look back, who do we consider were wise and courageous Christians? The civil rights, of course, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and we know about MLK, I don't think I need to belabor the example. Apartheid, where you had the Dutch Reformed Church that actually said apartheid is right. Blacks and mixed colors and whites are different kind of people, they should be separated, and here's a biblical argument for it. Well, obviously nobody's going to look at that, but there was also a mass of silent churches. And then you had the South African Council of Churches that said, it is time to stop. As Christians, we have a position. So I think the argument, I'm not claiming that I've solved the argument of it's too political and the church shouldn't be involved. What I hope to have done is to challenge that and to think seriously, really, this is happening here and now. This is not history, long history. This is happening here and now. And as a church, we have at least some responsibility, and let's think about what it is. And that's what earlier I encouraged you to write what your feelings and emotions were, and I think this is a good time to do it. And I don't think your emotions are necessarily going to be, oh yeah, that's right, let's do something wild and crazy. But is there somewhere a place for, we need to consider that with thoughtfulness and prayer. I want to show another slide, and this is about an event that now happens every year in Bethlehem. The Bethlehem, not Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, Bethlehem, like Jesus Bethlehem. And it's called Christ at the Checkpoint. And all kinds of different churches bring people to speak. And next year they will be speaking about the gospel in the face of religious extremism. And there'll be, of course, a lot of Christian speakers. It's largely a Christian conference. There'll be also Muslim and Jewish speakers. And that's a time and place to kind of look as the body of Christ. How do we speak about these things? And we're going to see a short video clip of Lynn Hybels. I don't know how many of you know Lynn Hybels, but she's part of a couple, Lynn and Mr. Hybel, who are Bill Hybel, who are kind of pastors in a big, relatively big church movement in the States, and actually believe her first visit to Palestine and the Bethlehem Bible College was at the same time as Brian McLaren, where they got to meet some of our friends, and that was kind of fun. And it's a 2-minute clip. It's shorter than the previous one, and where she tells us a little bit about what she's experienced and learned just by meeting people. So if we can see the clip.
But speaking at the conference forced me to kind of draw my thoughts together and say, what really do I believe about this? What have I learned? What conclusion do I come to? Where do I see Jesus in this? And what does it mean to be a Christian in that? And all of these perspectives have very significant impact on people's lives, on their daily lives, and radical impact. And yet, at the same time, there is the biblical prophetic call throughout Scripture to fight for justice, to fight for the cause of the marginalized and the oppressed, the poor, the weak, to be a voice for the voiceless. So where do all of these things fit together? And those are the kinds of questions that you can deal with at this conference. And I think it's really important because the implications of our theology are very great in this region. I think it's also really important to come to this conference because it's in Bethlehem, which means you get to see the reality of the occupation up close. And for many Americans, we hear about this conflict, we hear about the occupation, and we don't know what that really means. And so it's easy to give opinions and talk about this in a very theoretical way, but to actually be there and to understand what this conflict looks like and what the occupation looks like and the impact on very real people's lives. That brings a new reality to the theology. And I think it's important to put those two things together, the theology and the reality of daily life.
So I realize I've probably been speaking a little long, so we're going to move quickly, but I wanted to leave you with that comment from Lynn without commenting further, but I want to talk about the last argument, which is we don't want to support the terrorist. And let's be honest, none of our religions are squeaky clean. But right now, I would venture that we could say that parts of Islam right now are being a little tricky to handle and manage. I don't think that's an Islamophobic statement or a controversial statement. Last week, Boko Haram in northern Nigeria, it's a group that claims itself Muslim. Now we can say that's not true Islam, sure. But they claim that some Muslim killed 60 civilians. We know about ISIS and Daesh and all these things. And these people, excuse me for this stereotype, from us from here, they all look the same. So mentally, it's very easy for us to kind of associate all that. You know, sometimes I wear in the winter, I have a scarf that I got in Palestine. It looks like it's called a keffiyeh. It's a Palestinian scarf. I actually think it's quite pretty. But I also realize that when we see videos of ISIS, you know, on pickup trucks with guns, often these guys are wearing a keffiyeh, and in our minds there's some associations that are happening. And I'm not going to belabor this point. I think there's a complex, messed up world right now. The question is, as the church, who do we stand behind? What can we do? Is there a way to see clarity? I want to show you the next slide, a very confusing slide. Never do a slide like this. It's against all the rules of slide making. But those are all groups, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, secular, that work for peace and justice in the land. These people are stirred by that Franciscan prayer of both anger and belief that they can change something. And some of these people, I have the pleasure to know, actually a majority of the logos there, I'm kind of not too far removed from some of the people there, and they are remarkable people. They are Christian people who believe in justice, don't believe in anti-Semitism, don't believe in terrorism, but believe in bringing justice to the situation and changing the status quo. They are Jewish people. We already saw Jewish Voice for Peace, Other Voice. I mean, there are many other people. These people exist. These people exist. They stand, they speak, they take action, they take non-violent action, they reach out, they reach across. The group Musalaha is on the top left. We happened to meet for drinks the kind of founder of that group 3 weeks ago when he was visiting DC. It's remarkable what these guys are doing across religious barriers, challenging the political and violent status quo. And I don't think any of them have come with here's a 1, 2, 3 solution, everybody does this. But they've come with here's a 1, 2, 3, let's stop this. You know, there are many problems that are complex, but there are things we know we need to stop, and there are things that we can do. And these people, to me, both the Christian, the Jews, the Muslims, even the ones that claim no religion, the combatants for peace, those are people that used to support what we call here terrorists, and maybe they're terrorists if they engage violence against, Jewish civilians, for political purpose, and people that we call soldiers, also kill civilians, and they were on the two sides of that, and they were killing each other. And now they formed a group to say, we can work for peace. Can we have enough faith to start to believe with them? There's the bereaved families, people that have lost people to the other conflict. These people are able to say, your group has killed my child, and the other one says the same. And they're able to find the faith to sit together around the table. I do not imagine it is easy. But as a church, do we believe that those things are impossible? Do we believe that those things are pointless? Do we believe that we shouldn't get involved? Or do we believe that those are the people that, at least at heart and in our mind, and maybe in our prayers, and maybe tomorrow something else, we are a community of faith. We dare to dream of heaven on earth. And that means we're going to place our bets with these people. And that's a challenge. You know, I don't think I've given a lot of practical actions we can do today, and I think that's part of our discussion to be had in a community. But the last slide I have says, what are we going to do? You know, what can we do? What will we do? And I think that's not one that I can answer for us today. That's one we need to reflect about. And, but can we be people who pray for the peacemakers? Can we be people who hear the peacemakers? Can we be people who get to know some peacemakers? Can we get people who start to learn and understand? I've summarized some very complex things, but not so complex. When a person dies, a person dies. That's true in America today, that's true over there, that's true everywhere. Death and grief are one of the most common human experiences. Can we be a community that learns? Can we be a community that is disturbed? And can we be a community that moves beyond bias and confusion to kind of say, we know what we stand for, we know where we stand and where we're going to go. In terms of our principles, and in terms of how we view our neighbor, and in terms of how we see our religion, vis-a-vis these points about not doing anything. So I think that's a broader discussion. It continues on all the topics of social justice, and I think I'd like to close with, when we see injustice, you know, one of the reflexes that very natural for me is rise up in anger. Rise up, this is wrong, let's do something. And I think, yes, there's this prayer, you know, God give me anger, you know, God give me anger to be disturbed. And certainly there are times in history we want that, and to me that is part of the call. At the same time, if we want to grow as a community, I'm not sure we want to grow as a community of angry people or bitter people. So I think the challenge as a Christian community, the challenge is, how do we trade this scary, dangerous ground? And I'm speaking beyond today's topic, I'm speaking about our series. How do we trade on this ground? Be courageous, be learning, be open, discover a healing religion, and trade on grounds that are going to bring conflict between you and me. And do we believe that God is big enough, you know, to help us through that? So I'd like to close with a moment of silence. And when we're done, I'll read a psalm, which I want us to capture the spirit of how we can be inspired by God and by each other to grow into change. And that's really much the spirit that I hope, you know, carries to our discipleship groups discussion, to the forum we will have. But it's very much a call for action, but a call for peace as well. So let's just have a moment of prayer or silent reflection, and I'll close with a psalm, and then we'll move to communion. Lord, my heart is not proud, my eyes are not lifted high. I do not concern myself with matters too great or too awesome for me to grasp. Instead, I have calmed and quieted myself like a weaned child who no longer cries for its mother's milk. Yes, like a weaned child is my soul within me. O Israel, God will prevail. Put your hope in the Lord, now and always.